Hey, has anyone else noticed that the West is literally collapsing right now? Birth rates are tanking, trust in each other has eroded, institutions are breaking at the seams, men are checking out of the system, and now there are talks of a potential civil war. But you want to know what the most frustrating part is? The fact that no one in the mainstream seems to understand how we got here, and more importantly, what we need to do to preserve our civilization. The answer to that question isn't so simple, but one thing that is absolutely certain is that if we continue down the path we are on, our society and the principles they were built on will be gone. I know all of that seems scary, but I have some good news. This isn't the first time humanity has been here. Now granted, things are different in a lot of ways, but the overall patterns and principles have not changed. Humanity hasn't changed either. We are the same species now as we were before we even built the first civilizations. And if we are to understand how to fix Western civilization, we need to understand how early civilizations were built in the first place. In this video, we will explore how humanity moved from living in tribes to full-blown civilizations. Then, we will cover the moral foundation of civilizations, and lastly, we will cover how the collapse of the moral foundation led to the fall of the Roman Empire. To understand where we are headed, we need to go back, way back, all the way back to the beginning of humanity. Homo sapiens emerged around 300,000 years ago in North Africa. At this point, we were anatomically the same as we are now, but our brains haven't finished developing. Then, somewhere around 70,000 years ago, we went through what was known as the cognitive revolution, where our brains became about as developed as they are now, but we still had a long way to go before we could begin building civilization. At this point, we were living in tribes of about 30 to 100 people, usually no more than 150. That number, 150, is known as Dunbar's number. Human beings can only maintain about 150 trusting, meaningful relationships before trust begins to break down. Think of this as a cognitive limit on our ability to maintain relationships. If a tribe were to grow beyond this limit, trust would begin to break down and the tribe would split into subgroups. So if our brains still have this limit today, how is it possible we can maintain civility in cities of millions? Let's put a pin in that for now. Somewhere between 12,000 and 15,000 years ago, we hit another massive milestone, the agricultural revolution. Up until this point, we were still hunter-gatherers and usually nomadic, constantly moving around in search of resources. For the first time ever, we learned to domesticate plants and animals so that we could create more permanent settlements. These settlements were also much larger than tribes, typically ranging from a few hundred up to a couple of thousand. This pushed past Dunbar's number, making social cohesion fragile, but since cooperation meant an abundance of food, they made it work to a degree. But we're still limited in size. More importantly though, we partially solved one of the most enduring problems of our entire evolutionary history: scarcity. We were no longer constrained by the limited resources in our immediate environment, and for the first time ever, we started accumulating resources. But this created a new problem. Scarcity used to be a natural restraint on our animal instincts. In a small tribe, if you tried hoarding food, everyone would know immediately. You would quickly get banished from the tribe, and since everyone relied so heavily on each other, you would likely die. In a small tribe, if you committed an act of violence to a fellow tribe member, you would almost certainly be caught, banished, and died alone in the wild. In a small tribe, even the highest status males would struggle to provide for multiple wives. It's a common misconception that a few alpha males would get access to all of the women in the tribe while the rest of the men were unpartnered. Even if it were possible for a high-status male to provide for multiple wives, it would have led to many disgruntled single men who would have become violent and chaotic. In all of these examples, scarcity constrained behavior. Our ancestors may have wanted to do these things, but if they did, it would have likely led to harsh punishments or even death. But that all changed during the agricultural revolution. Since the settlements grew in size, you no longer had a tight-knit community that could see everything you do. You had a level of anonymity that allowed you to get away with hoarding, infidelity, and even violence. Since you could hoard food, you could also now support many wives, which created an imbalance in available mates, leading to unrest. No one talks about this enough, but the period after the agricultural revolution, better known as the Neolithic era, was actually very chaotic. Why? Because for the first time, human beings were no longer forced by scarcity to play nice, and so they didn't. But it was this very chaos that prevented them from growing into full-blown civilizations. Then, about 5,000 years ago, human beings finally developed a system that could help them rise above their instincts. They created abstract moral systems. An abstract moral system is a set of rules dictating how we ought to live that applies to everyone, even when no one is watching, and even when breaking the rules would be inconvenient. There are 3 keys to making this work. First, the rules need to apply to everybody, from the common folk all the way up to the elites. Second, you need rules that govern private behavior. You can't just follow the rules when someone is looking and then break them later. Behavior needed to be regulated even without witnesses around. To get that, you need the 3rd key, invisible enforcement. This one is the big one. This is where God comes in. In every major civilization, there was some form of transcendent, moralized authority. Some had a god or gods that saw everything that they did, even in private. Others had a cosmic order or karma that ensured bad behaviors get punished in this life or the next. Now, I'm not here to tell you what to believe. If you believe in God, I have the utmost respect for you. And if you don't, I can understand that too. My beliefs are a bit complicated right now, but regardless of what I believe, one thing is undeniable. The belief in this invisible force regulated human behavior enough to create civilization. By weeding out these problematic behaviors, humans created trust at scale. If you could trust that your neighbors will behave in a way that was moral, you could trust them without needing to know them personally. And that is how we finally overcame the limitations of Dunbar's number. So what happened to societies that finally established an abstract moral system? Well, they exploded. Once the moral system is established and widely accepted as truth, societies can stabilize within a few generations, up to a few hundred years. Once stabilized, they expand, and during the expansion, they create institutions founded in their new moral systems. They create law, bureaucracy, and hierarchies. Before you know it, you have a full-blown civilization. Once people can agree on how they should behave towards each other, trust can be established. People can cooperate, and together, they build civilizations that change the course of humanity. So far, we've talked about the development of these moral systems over time, but we haven't talked about what those rules actually are. And the crazy part is that civilizations all over the world all converge on the same core moral values. Sure, there are some differences, but there are 5 broad categories they all seem to agree on. First is sexual restraint. This one is a bit spicy, but it is also the most important of them all. I have a whole video planned on this one, so I'm gonna be brief about it here, but without this, civilizations never even get off the ground. And if a civilization had sexual restraint and then lost it, they would crumble within about 3 generations. It is that important. The biggest reason it's so important is due to the role that it plays in family formation. If you don't have a society that is sexually restrained, you don't get consistent family formation. And family is the backbone of any civilization. It produces well-adjusted human beings, establishes kin networks, and creates healthy communities. It also solves one of the biggest challenges with securing male investment: paternity uncertainty. Like I said, I've got a whole video on this one, but for now, I cannot understate how important this moral category is. Second, we have violence restraint. This one is pretty obvious as to why it's important. You can't have people running around killing each other if you want a trusting society. I will add that one of the biggest problems we faced in tribal times was the cycle of revenge. Violence does not live in a vacuum. If you killed someone for whatever reason, that person likely has a brother or father or uncle or cousin that probably isn't too happy about it. Then they come and they kill you, and now your family retaliates, and this creates a vicious cycle. By having morals on violence, you stop the cycle before it starts, and you outsource justice to a neutral third party. This ensures fairness and usually prevents retaliation from either side. Third, we have property and theft norms. These help maintain trust and fairness, but it also ensures long-term planning and investment in the future. If you can trust within reason that property you own isn't going anywhere, you can build wealth and invest in the future, turning people away from short-term thinking and encouraging long-term thinking. I'm going to expand on all of these moral categories in their own videos later, so I'm going to keep it short here. Fourth, we have morals around honesty, oaths, and trust. Promises mean something. Contracts are honored. This is essential for enabling trade and business, while also, again, encouraging cooperation and building trust. Fifth, we have morals respecting legitimate hierarchies. In order for anything significant to be built, you need humans organizing themselves into hierarchies, enabling those who are competent to rise through the ranks and lead. It is, however, not enough to just have hierarchies. Those leading the hierarchies need to be widely accepted as legitimate. Humans don't accept an authority to hold power unless they believe that they ought to have power. Power needs to be morally justified, seen as earned, and, most importantly, it needs to be constrained by the same moral order of those at the bottom. If those in power are corrupt and acting in ways that are immoral, why would anyone else restrain themselves? When legitimacy disappears, so does trust. The common theme among these moral categories is that they all restrain human nature in a way that our natural environments used to. And when human nature is effectively restrained, we get civilization. But what happens to a civilization that started off with a moral foundation only to abandon it by the time people forgot why it was important in the first place? When you remove the moral foundation, you get the fall of Rome. There's a lot of debate on why Rome fell exactly. I've seen lists of 30 or 40 different things historians cite as the reason, but historians converge on 5 major reasons as to why Rome collapsed, and I will prove to you how each of these 5 stem from the destruction of Rome's moral foundation. First, we have demographic decline. I'm gonna tell you something crazy. In the early Roman Empire, Emperor Augustus introduced the Lex Julia in 18 BCE. This was a series of laws that created penalties for being childless and unmarried. Could you imagine that today? Forget about tax incentives for having children. Augustus was straight up like, if you don't have kids, you're gonna pay me big time. To be fair, they did also have tax incentives for large families, but I swear, if Uncle Sam came knocking on my door because I don't have kids, I'm moving to Siberia. All craziness aside, the real question is, why was this law implemented in the first place? Well, it's because the birth rate in Rome was collapsing at the time. And why was the birth rate collapsing in Rome? For the same reason our population is collapsing. They removed the sexual restraint part of the moral foundation, which impacted family formation, and it got so bad that they needed to implement laws to try to fix it. Sadly though, this top-down enforcement never works. It didn't work then, and it doesn't work anywhere in the modern world where they tried baby-making incentives like in Japan or the Nordic countries. Only a bottom-up remoralization will fix that, but that will be its own video. Because of this demographic decline, Rome struggled to fill vital roles within the administration of the Roman government and bureaucracy. It also led to the next major reason for Rome's collapse: economic stagnation. Since the elites weren't reproducing, you get a shrinking tax base and less innovators and producers. This flips the economy from a mindset of growth to one of extraction. If the economic future is uncertain, it is human nature to stop thinking long-term and focus on short-term gain. Instead of investing in the future, people work to extract as much from the system before the system ceases to exist. The Roman elites engaged in rent-seeking behavior, officials taking bribes, corrupted tax collectors, debasing currency to fund spending. By the 3rd century, the Roman Empire's currency became basically worthless. And people even went back to bartering instead of trading with money. Another consequence of economic stagnation is political instability and elite competition. Even the politicians are now fighting to get what they can out of the system, and they use the levers of power to do it. Political leaders focused on extraction breeds corruption and fighting. During the 3rd century, there was a period of about 50 years where Rome had literally 20 emperors. Most of them got assassinated or overthrown, and there were civil wars breaking out all over the place. This struggle is a reflection on the decline in the importance of honesty, oaths, and trust, as leaders opted instead for betrayal. And when elites behave in ways that are immoral, their legitimacy tanks in the eyes of the people as well. Military hollowed out. Another consequence of demographic decline was the hollowing out of the military. If you don't have babies, you don't have soldiers. So what do? You hire soldiers from outside places. The problem with that, though, is that if you're no longer fighting for your home and country, but instead fighting for a paycheck, you aren't going to be as willing to sacrifice yourself. How are you going to spend that money if you're dead? The imported army lacked conviction and allegiance to Rome, making them weak and ineffective against outside forces, of which there were many. The last major factor in Rome's collapse seems trivial, but believe me, it is incredibly important to the health of any civilization: moral traditions. Earlier in Roman civilization, there was a concept called mos maiorum, meaning customs of the ancestors. It was essentially a shared identity, a moral role. Romans were proud to be Roman, and they were expected to act in ways that were disciplined, restrained, loyal to family and state, and willing to sacrifice for Rome. It almost seems hard to believe, since now modern Western civilization has completely lost their own sense of pride in who they are, pride in their culture, pride in their civilization that they've built, respect for the sacrifices of all their ancestors before them that gave up their personal freedoms for the greater good of their nation. Without this sense of pride and responsibility, the Romans stopped asking, "What can I give for my nation?" and instead they focused on their own selfish desires. It might seem trivial. How can a few people being selfish and looking out for themselves cause a system to collapse? But the thing is, a society is nothing more than the people in it. And when most of the people are focused on themselves, when most are asking what my country can do for me instead of what I can do for my country, that civilization is on its way to collapse.